we will get started. Please welcome to the July 11th Houston County Historical Society meeting 2023. We will call the meeting to order. If you will please silence your phones. There is a sign-in sheet going around. If you would sign in, please. We'll start off by the pledge to the flag with Mr. Kent Bale reading our pledge, please.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
You may be seated. Thank you. The meeting minutes. Did anybody have any questions, corrections, discussions? Everybody receiving them okay?
I've got a statement to make.
Okay.
I want to thank everybody in here that signed that goodwill card and sent it to me.
It looks like it worked. All right, we need a motion then to approve the minutes as written. Okay, David, second.
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Treasurer's report, Ms. Leah.
Okay. The treasurer report for June, we had expenses of $22.05. I'm sorry, we had income of $22.05. We had expenses of $28.35. So we have $2,006.62 in the checking account. Now, on the 5th, we had the CD rolled over on the 1st, and so I had to wait until after that to roll it over because it was a Saturday. So on the 5th, I went to the bank and I rolled over, and there's now $1,000 extra in the money book. There was $1,000 extra in the money market that I spent today. In fact, Jamie Bybee at Computer One is helping me acquire the equipment because we are tax-free. He can help us get it tax-free. There's a computer, a projector, and a copy of Microsoft Office. So I wrote a check for almost $725 to him today. In addition, I wrote for today a check for $120 to pay for the insurance for our World War II program for our next meeting. There's a rider to cover us at the high school.
Which was required by the school system.
By the school system.
For us to have that,
For us to-
which is a good idea, great idea.
Because we have insurance that covers like this meeting, but it's for special events, we needed additional coverage.
Okay. Any questions on the treasurer's report? Old business. Please note in the minutes of last time, the items that are available for purchase. We still have maps and books and things, and too numerous to mention, but if you're still in need of any of those, we have those available. I guess for our old business, I don't know that we have any new business. Our old business, I'll let Jackie and or Donald update us on the World War II program.
As everybody knows, we've been working on this for about a year, and it's coming down to the wire. So we appreciated the seed money that we got back starting the year. That was $300. And as we approached getting ready for our program, we decided that we need additional funds. So we're going to be asking for $300 more to finish out our program as far as the insurance, and we're going to get some security people and that sort of thing, and we'll have a lot of copying and all that stuff. So I'd like to make a motion that we authorize and allocate $300 more for the World War II program.
I second.
All in favor? And all opposed?
We appreciate everybody sharing their information and pictures with us and have a bunch of pictures. We brought just a few over here to get a chance after the program on the table. This is just a small part of them, but we really appreciate everybody that shared pictures and information and stuff. And we could probably make a program on each veteran, and so it's just hard to condense it down to an hour, but that's what we're going to try and do. But the information will be there in the archives. And of course, what I'm looking for is we're going to need some help setting up the Friday before, like the 18th, after school lets out. We've got a bunch of stuff we need to move in and set up. Emily Moore is supposed to help us on that. The same thing, we'll be out there Saturday morning. Then after the program, we're just going to move the stuff more or less, probably just inside the forum or whatever. And then Mr. Rutherford's going to let the high school kids come from like 11:30 to 1:30 on Monday. We're going to Tennessee Ridge Elementary School on Wednesday, and then the middle school on Thursday after the program and everything. So what I've got is a sign-in sheet. If you can commit to a time or anything, I'll just pass this around with them. I appreciate any help that you all could give us on that. And I guess that's about everything I have. The only other thing, if you're going to bring any memorabilia, if you can let us know, we'll make sure you've got a table, and we're going to set those inside the form where you can set any memorabilia that you bring. So you or your representative will be right there with you before it gets throughout the edge and walk off. But hope everybody can come. It's getting down close. I think just about another month and everything. But we appreciate all the help.
Okay, that announces our next meeting for August. So that will be fun, and there's a lot of work being put into it, and I think it'll be rewarding for you to see that. If you are unable to see the screen before Zach gets started, you may want to move over to this side, because the screen is not really movable, but you all are. So. Our program tonight is Mr. Zach Kinslow. He is the Executive Director of the Clement Railroad Hotel Museum in Dixon. And it's going to be all about Lucille, and you will have family members in the audience, so watch out.
I'll try to be good. How are y'all? Good. Happy to have you all here tonight. As she mentioned, my name is Zach Kinslow. I am the Executive Director of the Clement Railroad Hotel Museum in beautiful and historic downtown Dixon, Tennessee. Now, a show of hands to make my job a little bit easier. Who's been to the museum? All right, so you've seen it. I don't have to tell you anything at all. You know, it's the easiest program I've ever done. But yeah, so I've been the director of the Clement Museum since 2020, so I'm in my third year now as director of the site. Prior to that, I hold a master's degree in U.S. history from Austin Peay State University, which I happened to come upon when one of my professors was Dr. Manoah Uffelman. When I started the first week I was at the Clement, I was going through the old guest book for the Hotel Halbert, which was the building that Clement Museum is in now. And of course the page needed to be turned, so what better day to turn the page to than my own birthday, so I know what the last date was. Turned it to May 15th. It was May 15th, 1921. There were 3 people that signed in that day, all Uffelmans, all from Erin, Tennessee. So I called the only Uffelman I knew. Well, it was her great uncle, her great aunt, and her great great uncle. So we did an article with the Dixon Herald on it. Did an interview. It was my first interview I did with the Clement Museum. Mentioned that I came from a small town called Mount Pleasant, Tennessee. I graduated in a class of only 64 people. Now, when they ran the story, they said I graduated in a class of 64. And everybody told me how good I looked to be in my 70s. And I've just been riding that wave ever since. Yeah, so I hold a master's degree in U.S. history from Austin Peay State University. I worked for 5 years at the President James K. Polk Home and Museum in Columbia, Tennessee. I worked on the presidential papers of Martin Van Buren. And now all I do is talk about the Clements and trains. And I'm very excited to be here in Houston County, which I have been to several times, and I love every trip I have coming out here. So let's talk a little bit about the building I work in before we get into the program itself, just so we can, do I need to be louder?
No, I'll keep the lights.
Oh, okay, that works too. My mom says I'm loud enough. I usually don't have to get much louder. So the building I work in is the old Hotel Halbert. It was built in 1913 by Mr. J.T. Halbert, operated as a railroad hotel from 1914 until 1954. When railroad hotels across the country closed, they built the interstate. People buy cars. They're no longer driving passenger trains. Throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, the building was a bunch of different things. Farm Bureau headquarters, businesses, Chamber of Commerce, a different Clement Museum, private residence. In 2009, we opened with the museum in Dixon. We were solely a museum, and no matter how many times people call me a month, we no longer admit guests to the hotel. Not since 1954 has that happened. But our bread and butter, the things that really makes us a museum, is the fact that on June the 2nd, 1920, future governor of Tennessee, Frank G. Clement, was born in room number 5 of the hotel. His grandmother was the manager of the building. Her name was Belle Goat, a widow from Scottsville, Kentucky. Moved to the hotel in 1913, brought her entire family with her, and her family, of course, was living in the building. June the 2nd, 1920, Governor Clement was born there. And so, one thing we talk a lot about at the museum is Frank G. Clement. But we also have to mention his wife, Lucille Christianson Clement. And, you know, we got to thinking, and this is something we kind of been mulling over since I came to the Clement, is talking more about women in our history. Tend to be, when we focus on history, talking about an individual like Frank Clement, we tend to focus solely on the governor, not the people that really supported him and made him really who he was too much there. And so we did an exhibit. It opened last month. It'll be running through April. I encourage all of you to come see it. Hopefully by the end of this program you'll want to come see it. It's called All About Lucille. For the first time since its opening in 2009, the Clement Museum is doing an entire exhibit focusing solely on our First Lady, your First Lady of the state of Tennessee, Lucille Christianson Clement. And so I have learned a lot about her. I've got to meet a lot of great people that knew her. And so let's get right into it. You ready? Don't sound like it. Are you ready? There we go. All right, so Lucille Christianson was born here in Erin, Tennessee, June the 30th, 1920, to Laverne and Nelson Christianson. Her father served as a judge in Houston County and for some time as mayor, so she came from a fairly modest but well-off-to-do background. This enabled her to have a pretty good education growing up. She was able to get lessons in piano, in violin, in tap dancing. And she would use those skills later as First Lady to really help entertain and help Frank's political career as he is running the state. Now this is a great image we were able to find here. This is the Christianson family in front of the old courthouse here in Houston County. Now, I can lean over here. Lucille's education, of course, when she was in high school, she went to Erin High. Now, she was on the girls' basketball team. She was a big sports fan. And in 1937, she's 17 years old. Frank Clement is also 17 years old. Frank Clement was born June the 2nd, 1920. 28 days later, all the way in Erin, Tennessee, Lucille was born. So 28 days apart, they're the same age. Frank Clement goes to Waverly. So Lucille is on the basketball team at the high school. Very good team. They go to an all-star girls basketball game in Waverly. Frank Clement and his cousin Jimmy Weems also go to the game. Now they're there just to watch the girls play. When the team runs out on the court without ever having met Lucille Christianson, Frank Clement, the rumor has it, he put his elbow in Jimmy Weems' side, pointed at her, and said, "I'm going to marry that one." Now he was very persistent. At age 16, Frank Clement began saying, "I'm going to be governor of the state," and everything he did was aimed at that single goal. Marrying Lucille seemed to be his number 2 goal, which he was going to work on first. So he attends the game. After the game, the team goes to have dinner, and 17-year-old Frank Clement finds out where the team's eating. He walks in, walks up to Lucille, pretends to be looking for her brother to start a conversation. Over the course of dinner, he asks her on a date, which she said, "No, I'm already going on a date with another guy." Frank Clement was charismatic. He was persistent. By the end of the dinner, she was out of that date and into a date with Frank Clement. Now, they're going to date for about 3 years. And when they're around 19 years old, they decide they want to get married. And from my understanding, the family maybe felt they were a little bit too young to be getting married. And said, maybe just wait a little bit. So they moved, they ran to Hopkinsville, Kentucky, where they were married on January 6, 1940 by a Reverend Southern. Great name. I love it. He they lied on their marriage certificate, said they were not 19, said they were 21 years old. And their first night as a married couple, they come from Hopkinsville back down to Erin. They're staying at her family's home, which I believe was over here where the Regions parking lot is now. Now, this is a story I have heard, and a couple people here know this story I've told before. So they come down on their honeymoon. Nelson and Laverne say, all right, you're married. Well, nothing we can do about it now. It's your honeymoon. Why don't you take your brother Jiggs's room? It's bigger. When he comes home, he wasn't there. When he comes home, we'll just tell him that y'all are married and y'all got his room for the night. Well, parents went to bed, nobody told Jiggs. He comes home, he goes to his room, he finds Frank and Lucille on their honeymoon. He doesn't know they're married, so he leaves the room to go find a gun to kill Frank Clement. And Lucille has to run out wearing nothing but a bathrobe, explaining they are married, it's okay in the eyes of God, and with the family. He ended up sleeping on the couch that night. Now, Frank and Lucille would be married for 29 years, up until Frank's death. They would have 3 children together. The oldest, Bob Clement, who went on to be an 8-term U.S. congressman. The middle child, Frank Clement Jr., would go on today serving as a judge on the Tennessee State Court of Appeals. And the youngest was James Gary Clement. And of course, we will talk about all of them. But Lucille's married life is going to begin a period of sacrifice for her husband's political ambitions. Now, Lucille always dreamed of the spotlight. Her son, Bob Clement, has told me on more than one occasion, Mother always wanted to be a movie star, but her parents wouldn't let her move to Hollywood, so she ran off with Frank Clement. I guess being First Lady is a good consolation prize if you can't make it to Hollywood. So she always kind of dreamed of being in the spotlight, but Frank Clement had that drive and ambition. And with that means he's not going to be home all the time. Frank they get married when they're 19. He's in college. So she goes to work to help pay bills. She works at a radio station in Nashville. Well, in 1941, he joins the FBI, youngest agent in the country. They send him to Chicago to infiltrate the mob. He looks so young. He took down Roger Toohey, Al Capone's number 2. What does Lucille during that time? She's in Chicago. She works at a department store. She's the one running the house. She's the one paying the bills. She's the one helping do everything while Frank is away. He's an attorney. He's a rising politician. He's in the military. He has gone quite a bit. Someone's got to run the home. Someone's got to take care of the kids. She is juggling everything, sometimes on her own. And this is going to really shape the kind of First Lady Lucille is. Now, if you look at this picture here, it's a great picture. That's her and her husband with President Harry Truman right in the middle. President Truman would be very close to Governor Clement and his family there. So, Frank Clement, he's kind of moving around. Lucille's moving with him. And then in 1952, they're both, Frank and Lucille, they're 32 years old. And Frank decides, you know what? It's time to run for governor. So Frank Clement runs for governor. He is 32 years old. He is going to challenge the sitting governor, Gordon Browning, who at this point has been governor for 6 years, 3 terms. Back then, governor terms were 2 years. Pretty popular guy. And this is a time when the South as a whole predominantly is dominated pretty much exclusively by the Democratic Party. That would change starting in the mid-1960s. And so whoever won the Democratic nomination was pretty much going to be governor. Kind of think about the way it is today with Republicans. If a Republican wins the nomination, they're probably going to be our next governor. Back then it was the Democratic Party. Frank Clement challenges Gordon Browning in his own primary and defeats the man. Goes on to win the election of 1952 to be governor of the state of Tennessee. Now, Lucille is going to be on the campaign trail a lot during this time. She is going to go with Frank from town to town, from city to city. She's going to have to keep up appearances. She always has to look good. In fact, one of the things that I always notice is every single article I have ever seen written about the woman has one word in it that is the exact same. Pretty. They always talk about Lucille's looks. Now, she was a gorgeous woman. But you got to think, what would that do to a person over time if constantly in the press, always being called pretty, always being referenced with your looks? That may take its toll in a certain way. That idea that you have to kind of look and act a certain way. But she made speeches. She visited towns. She shook hands. She had to go from town to town to capture and then hold new voters. And it paid off. Frank Clement was elected the youngest modern governor in the history of the state of Tennessee, only 32 years old. Lucille becomes First Lady at age 32. When she hears of her husband's election as governor, she mentioned very plainly, one sentence, that she was looking forward to her new responsibilities and duties with keen anticipation. We had a modern First Lady. We had a... by the way, she's, I believe, the First Lady born in the 20th century in the state of Tennessee. Now, what we have here, if you can see this image, one of the great things we have on display in this exhibit is Lucille Clement's inaugural gown. That is a beautiful, beautiful dress. So Frank Clement was elected to 3 terms as governor, so he has 3 inaugurations, 1953, 55, and 63. Unfortunately, the 1953 and 1955 gown, nobody knows what happened to it. Lucille never gave them to the State Museum. The State Museum doesn't know where they are, and the Clement family also doesn't know where they are. The 1963 gown she did send to the State Museum before her passing, so we actually have it on display. It's custom made by Mr. Blackwell, if anyone remembers him. If you watch the Oscars in the 70s, he was really big on there. He was the first fashion designer, major designer, to ever debut a line of clothing on television. Was the first designer to ever debut the same line in plus sizes. He created the worst dress list, which is why he was so big at the Oscars. He always critiqued what everyone was wearing. He dressed everyone from Nancy Reagan to Jane Mansfield to Cher to Lucille Clement. And one thing I have learned is he used a lot more material dressing Lucille than he did Cher. But this gown was custom made. 1962, he flew in from LA to Nashville. Not only designed the gown, but made it himself. Every sequin, every bead is hand-stitched by Mr. Blackwell. It is a beautiful, beautiful piece that we are very happy to have on display. And it'll be on display through April of next year. And I encourage you to see it, because once it goes back to the State Museum, it goes in a box in storage and won't be seen again until they have a specific need for that. It's not on permanent display. So we are very, very, very glad to have that. Now, mentioning as First Lady, Lucille is going to hold an annual open house, inviting people from all over the state to come see the governor's residence. Which, by the way, the Clement family were the second governor's family to live in the governor's residence. Tennessee was the last state in the country to provide housing for our chief executive. Prior to 1946, the governor and their family had to basically rent an apartment in Nashville at the time. So the home was purchased in 1946. Gordon Browning got to live in it first, but the Clements are really the ones who make it a home. And boy, did they make it a home. Lucille's children, Frank Clement used to say that the only scandal he had his entire time as governor were his 3 sons. They had 2 Tennessee walking horses. They had a Shetland pony named Mr. Politics. They had 150 chickens, 50 turkeys. They had 150 guinea pigs. Started out with 2, but they just kept going. Ended up selling those to Vanderbilt for medical testing. And they had a monkey, which, of course, Bob Clement likes to say, Frank Jr. fed it a bunch of candy and it died. Sorriest pet he ever had. But Lucille is also having to watch over all of these things. And she is doing a great job at it. Really kept them in line, kept the house running. She is going to make a bunch of television appearances. She is going to model clothing on the Today Show. She is going to make many, many interviews. Sports Illustrated interviewed her at one point, which we'll talk about that here in just a second. But as First Lady, you know, she's going to go all around the state. During the 10 years they are governor and First Lady of this state, Lucille is going to travel all over. And I found this, I had to put it in here just because of where I'm speaking. In 1963, Lucille was Grand Marshal of the Irish Temple. She came back home to Erin. She came back to Houston County to participate in something that means a lot to this area there. So I had to put the program in there. I'd feel bad about myself if I did not. Now, Lucille, unlike her husband, I mentioned she's going to be really well loved. Unlike her husband, who is very charismatic, very boisterous, and doesn't shy away from making enemies if he believes he's doing the right thing, Lucille is going to remain fairly quiet, fairly reserved. She's not going to speak out too often on political issues. She will. I'll show you something she talks about here in just a second. But this means that she is going to be greatly endeared to even the people that don't like Frank Clement. I always say it's like, if you didn't like Ronald Reagan, you could like Nancy. If you didn't like John Kennedy, you might like Jackie. If you didn't like Frank Clement, you might like Lucille. And that was not lost on people. Gordon Browning, which by the way, before I go to this next slide, I want to point this out here. This is a portrait of Lucille that was painted in 1956. And as I learned today, this portrait was actually presented to Lucille on the courthouse steps here in 1956. We currently have it on display in our exhibit at the Clement Museum. It belongs to her son Bob Clement, and it'll go back to him once our exhibit is done. But it is absolutely gorgeous, beautiful, beautiful painting that we have there. But Lucille is going to be very well loved, very well liked by even people that don't like her husband. Gordon Browning. Now, I've said his name a couple times. Anyone remember who he was? He was the governor. He was the governor Frank Clement beat. Not once, but twice. In 1954, Gordon Browning came back and tried to beat Frank Clement. Of course, Clement beat him by about 10 more points than he beat him the first time. But Gordon Browning went on record as saying, Lucille and the young boys are the only decent things about Frank Clement. They like Lucille. Frank Clement even understood this. Frank Clement is on record as saying, I wish everybody could meet my wife. They might like me better. We also have that portrait right there. That's the official portrait of Governor Frank Clement, painted in 1958 by artist Martin Kellogg. It is on display also at the Clement Museum. Outside of the Capitol Building and the State Museum, we are the only place in the state of Tennessee you'll find a governor's official portrait on display currently. But being so loved also means that Lucille gets away with certain political conversations that other people may have a harder time getting around. Mentioning sports. Mentioning Lucille loved basketball. Well, she also was a very avid golfer. Sometimes you'll see her with a bandage on her hand in some photos, usually a golf injury, is from what I've been told by her family, is what that was. Lucille was interviewed by Sports Illustrated in 1956. She's First Lady of Tennessee. They were in Chicago, Illinois, for the Democratic National Convention. Frank had been invited to be the keynote speaker at the 1956 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. First Tennessean to ever speak at a national convention, gave a historically renowned keynote speech. If you can find it, I encourage you. It's an amazing, amazing speech there. But Lucille was interviewed. And the interviewer asked her basically what she thought about men and women playing sports together. This is a political conversation we're still having today. Should men and women be playing in co-ed leagues? Now her response, and I typed it up so you don't have to read the tiny bit there. She said, that's so silly to ask a woman. Don't you know that all women would rather play golf with men than just compete among themselves? But she threw in a caveat. She said, but I have one exception. If the men are really serious about their score in golf, the women should encourage them to play among themselves. She's giving a political statement without really giving a political statement. She's going to speak her mind, but she is going to veil it in a way that is palatable and still endears her to people that maybe disagree with her belief in that. Now, as First Lady, she's not just going to make these appearances. She's not just going to sit in a parade, float and wave. She's not just going to make a couple speeches here and there. She is going to actively be involved. She had an education. She was a very smart, very capable woman, and she is going to work very hard for her state. During the third term, they were re-elected to a third term in 1962. They were governor and first lady from 1953 to 59. Because of our Constitution, they had to take a 4-year break, and then they came back from 1963 to 1967. It is during this period that Lucille is going to get even more involved, basically, in the administration than she had been before. Specifically in the realm of foreign relations. Now, it's 1963. Two things I'll mention here. The two biggest countries she was really involved with were Sweden and Japan. Why Sweden? Well, the Christiansons are of Swedish descent, so that was of particular interest to her. In fact, I didn't have time to include it in the PowerPoint here. There's a great photo of Frank and Lucille at a steak dinner with the King of Sweden. And actually, that photo was put all over Swedish news at the time. It was a really big deal because she got interested in the medallion the king was wearing. She reached up and just grabbed it to get a closer look. You don't touch the king. That's part of the etiquette. You don't touch him. But he loved it. He thought it was great. So she was a big hit in Sweden and really helped forge that relationship there. Japan is going to be the bigger thing for her, though. In 1963, Frank and Lucille Clement are the first sitting governor and first lady in the history of Tennessee to travel to Japan. Now, it's nearly 20 years after World War II has ended. Japan, we have worked heavily to rebuild their economy, to keep the threat of communism, since they're so close to Soviet Russia, from coming into Japan. And Japan is booming. They are the place for foreign investment. So Frank and Lucille go to Japan in '63. And on display in the exhibit we have a lot of pieces from this trip. We have brochures, we have maps with Lucille's handwriting all over it. But we don't just have tourist pieces. We have a book called Living Japan. She is going to be learning about Japanese culture, about Japanese history. She is learning about the people, how they act, how they respond, what are their interests, what are their disinterests. She needs to make a good impression on the Japanese people because they're trying to get an investment in the state of Tennessee. And it works. The Japanese love Lucille. They like Frank. They love Lucille. And they get it. They get the investment. The first foreign investment from Japan in Tennessee. Other governors, particularly Lamar Alexander, would build upon that, but the Clements lay the foundation. And today, because of the work the Clements started, Frank and Lucille, together, not one or the other, together, Japan is the #1 foreign investor in the state of Tennessee today. 10% of all foreign investment in Tennessee is Japanese. Mitsubishi. I got you. They're made here. That goes into the work Lucille put in during this time. Now she is eventually, especially in the 60s, in that third term, starting in the second term in the 50s, she is going to start to sour on politics. Not like it quite as much as she had. The political attacks were really getting to her. Frank Clement is notable in American history. In 1955, he became the first Southern governor in the history of the country to ever veto a segregation bill. He was the only Southern governor during the Civil Rights Movement to publicly support the movement. He oversaw the integration of the first public high school. Clinton High in Anderson County, East Tennessee, integrated a full year before Little Rock. And when the segregationists bombed the school, he sent in 600 National Guardsmen, 250 highway patrolmen, and he went there himself. First time a National Guard had ever been used in the history of this country to support civil rights instead of oppose it. Some things are going to frighten Lucille. A man named John Casper, who was he was a Klansman, he was a member, he was the president of the White Citizens Council for the Eastern Seaboard, goes to Clinton. He declares that he won't leave the state till Governor Clement's dead. Now, as Bob Clement has told me, there was no fence, there was no gate at the governor's residence at this time. There was a highway patrolman behind every tree, but there wasn't a fence to keep people out. Frank could take the political attacks. He could take the criticism. He could take just the hatred people would have for the family simply because they had political disagreements, and it just roll off his back. He always said, when they quit talking about you is when you need to start worrying. But it got to Lucille. Every attack on her family she took very personally. She loved her family deeply and didn't want people talking bad about her. And so she soured on politics and wouldn't really get as involved towards the end of the administration as she had been. Now, Lucille's, I think one of her greatest legacies is one that's not quite as often talked about. Lucille, they had 3 children, as I mentioned, Bob, Frank Jr., and Gary. Gary was born in early December 1952. So that is after the election, but before the inauguration. Of course, we're taking a step back towards the 50s. Now we've gone to the 60s, we're going back. After the birth of Gary, as so many women do, Lucille developed postpartum depression. And at times it could be pretty severe. Frank saw this. You know, Lucille had always kind of wanted the spotlight, but the moment she got it, she's First Lady of the state. It's not really a time where she wants too many people looking at her. And she's going to work within that, really kind of keeping her wraps. It's the 50s. You don't really talk about it. You ignore it. The problem only gets worse if you don't talk about this problem. Frank sees this, and he wants to help his wife. He wants to make sure she gets help. But when he looked at the system, he wasn't comfortable with it. The mental hospitals in the state of Tennessee in 1953 were under the umbrella of the penal institutions. The Department of Corrections was running hospitals in this state. Prison guards were in charge of patients, not doctors. And he looked at the situation. If I am not comfortable giving my wife help, and I'm governor of the state, what is just the average Tennessean feeling? So in 1953, he did an amazing thing. He separated the Department of Mental Health from the Department of Corrections. We were the 11th state in the country to have a Department of Mental Health. First in state history. We also have to understand that it's politics. It's the 50s, it's the 60s. Lucille is not going to receive treatment in a mental hospital in the state of Tennessee, even though her issues were a contributing factor in Frank creating the department. He thought about his voters. Lucille would go to Virginia, oftentimes to receive treatment. And in some ways it worked, in some ways, the 50s and the 60s, they still had ways to go. But I think that really humanized them. If we have not suffered from depression ourselves, we all know somebody that has. It humanizes, it brings them down. One thing I really admire about the entirety of the Clement family is they kind of never forgot where they came from. They never looked down on people. They looked at them, they looked across, they looked at them as equals. And they really make strides in many, many ways. Frank Clement is going to tragically pass away on the night of November 4th, 1969, in an automobile accident. He was driving from Nashville to Franklin, was involved in a car crash. He died that night. He was only 49 years old. Lucille was only 49 years old when she lost her husband. She would outlive her husband by 26 years. And during her widowhood, she is going to spend a lot more time with family. She is going to travel. She is going to continue to make speeches, continue to make public appearances. When her sons run for office is when she gets back into politics. When Bob's campaigning for Public Service Commission and then Congress, and Frank in his legal career, she greatly supports them. Didn't mention this, but one of Frank Clement's greatest accomplishments, I believe, as governor was the education system in Tennessee. Believe it or not, his third term as governor, 1963 to 1967, 80% of his budget was designated towards education. 80% of the state budget towards education. We had the highest funded education system in the country at the time. He is also going to waive a prerequisite. If you were going to go to school, it was free. Our Constitution says you have to have that. But there was a prerequisite before 1953. If you were going to go to school, you had to buy your own textbook. If you could not afford a textbook, you could not go to school. Now, who does that benefit? Doesn't benefit the child, doesn't benefit the family, doesn't benefit the state. So Frank is going to go to As governor, he's going to go to the legislature. He's going to ask for money to buy every public school textbooks in the state. He got that through. Every child in this state has the opportunity of a free public education because of Frank Clement. And he also created a community college system. He thought there needed to be a cheaper local public option that worked around the schedule of a working adult. 18 months. He walked into his office and said, I want to make a college. 18 months later, Columbia State opened. It's the first community college in the South. Every southern state replicated our system. It was so successful. Education was really big with the Clements. And based on that, every public college and university in this state has a Clement building. And all of them are named after the governor, but one. East Tennessee State University, in the early 90s, named Clement Hall the Lucille Clement Hall. It's the women's dormitory. That's actually a photo of her there with the Lucille Clement building. Only one named for her in the state, college building in the state. Only one not named after her husband. In her later years, like I said, she's going to spend a lot of time campaigning with her kids. She's going to travel. But her later years were not without tragedy as well. I mentioned her youngest child, Gary. Gary passed away at a fairly young age, in his early 30s. And he didn't have as much of a connection to Dixon or Erin like Lucille would. Or Dixon like Frank and Bob and maybe Frank Jr. did. Gary was born when they became governor and first lady. So Gary pretty much spent his entire life in Nashville and Davidson County. So when he died, he was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in Nashville. And Lucille kind of knew where she wanted to be. She herself passed away on December 29th, 1995, at age 75. She had lived 26 years without Frank. And several years without Gary. Frank Clement is buried at the Clement plot, the Dixon Memorial Gardens in Dixon, Tennessee, right outside of Montgomery State Park. Lucille was not buried with her husband, feeling that Frank had enough family surrounding him in Dixon. But Gary was alone in Nashville. She wanted to be buried next to Gary. And that is where she is. And that is where she will be for the rest of the time there. Lucille is going to be remembered as a great Tennessean, a woman who deeply loved her family and worked towards the best interests of all Tennesseans. As Billy Graham said in a eulogy to her, she was a remarkable woman married to a flamboyant governor. But in her own right, Lucille was a brilliant woman who worked tirelessly for her family, for her state. And there's really something to be said in all of that. Do we have any questions? I must have been that good. I answered every question you got. Any comments? I understand we got some family here tonight, people that knew her. Anyone got a story they'd like to tell? I'd love to hear these things. You got too many of them, don't you?
Yeah. So just going to the governor's mansion to spend the night was big enough. And then I met Elvis Presley there.
Yeah.
So that was big.
It's a good night.
I got that, Kathy Sue, and I met, because of Lucille and my mother, I got to meet Dinah Shore. I have a picture of me and Dinah Shore in the governor's office, and Lucille.
Oh, the Clements were, I usually tell people on tour, the best way I can explain them is Tennessee's version of the Kennedys. They're all into politics, they're a very good-looking bunch, and they're young, they're charismatic, they're great. Frank Clement, when he became governor in the 50s, there was a congressman, I believe from Ohio, who made a comment that country music was obscene and should be taken off the radio. We got to think about that. What does country music talk about? There's a lot of drinking, a lot of womanizing, a lot of getting rowdy. That's not something you want the youth of America to emulate. But how do you think the governor of Tennessee feels about you attacking country music? So he goes before Congress and testifies, you can't do that, First Amendment and intellectual property rights. Not a lot of people were defending musicians at this time. So stars fell in love with Frank Clement. Frank Clement could attract thousands and thousands of people to his rallies. He was a great speaker. Gordon Browning used to tell his supporters, don't go hear Frank Clement speak because you might end up voting for the SOB. Good speaker if your opponent's saying that. But he also had people, Johnny Cash would open for him at rallies. And one night at the governor's residence, got a phone call. Like I said, if any of you or anybody you wanted to come meet the Clements in Nashville, got a phone call and there was a weird little Dutch accent on the other side. Hey, Governor, this is Colonel Tom Parker. Elvis Presley wants to come visit. Can he come over? Of course, Frank said, yeah. Of course, Elvis was a bigger fan of Governor Clement than Governor Clement was a fan of Elvis. Just generationally different kinds of music. Elvis came over, and Elvis was a big fan of a singing group called the Prisonaires. The Prisonaires, if you recall the song, Just Walking in the Rain, bigger hit when Johnny Ray re-recorded it in 1961. It was originally done in 1954 by the Prisonaires. They were a quintet incarcerated completely at the Tennessee State Penitentiary. They were a great singing group. Elvis was a big fan. And they go back and forth. I believe they're actually the inspiration for Jailhouse Rock. That song there, but eventually Governor Clement had to kick them all out because he had to go to bed by 3 o'clock in the morning. But yeah, so I mean, we got a lot of stories of that. There was a German Weimaraner given to the family. It was a pet dog. They named Roy because it was given to them by Roy Rogers. We got a photo at the museum on display of the Clement family. Lucille's right center in it with Fess Parker. Bob Clement's wearing the coonskin cap and one shoe. He doesn't know why he's not wearing the other shoe, but he knows why he has the cap on. Yeah, the Clements were really big with musicians. They themselves were musicians in a way. Frank Clement came from a musical family. Lucille, very gifted on the piano. Beautiful player. Of course, Frank would sing with her. It'd be a whole show.
Her mother was a beautiful violinist.
I'm sure they made an amazing pair.
Eddie Arnold.
Eddie Arnold, yeah. They were good friends with that. In fact, Eddie Arnold, of course, he was the first president of the Country Music Association. Frank Clement was on their board of directors, the original board. Because of his defense of country music, they made sure he got that. So Lucille was right there with him in everything he did.
And Minnie Pearl lived right in that same neighborhood.
She did. In fact, the property line is on the tennis court.
Okay.
Her side was her side, and their side was the governor's. She just played everyone that moved in. But yeah, they were very good. They were close. They were good friends. Of course, she's from Hickman County, and Frank's from Dixon County, and Houston County's right there. So they kind of had.
And I met the monkey.
You met the monkey? For the short time he was there.
And it was Easter eggs.
Oh, was that what he ate? Well, Bob says it gave him a heart attack, and he blamed it.
Yeah.
But hey, thank you all for having me out here tonight. I hope I didn't bore you. I hope I kept it lively. And I hope you learned a lot about an amazing First Lady this state has had. So, thank you. Oh yeah, upcoming things we have at the Clement Museum. Let me think. Here's a bunch. So I got to think about, I'm also on a bunch of different boards too, so I got to think about what's mine versus what I we have, of course, our big exhibit is going to be all about Lucille, which will be up through April of 2024. Coming up this fall, we are going to open a new exhibit alongside All About Lucille, calling it Face of a Governor, which is going to be telling the story of Frank Clement through the images of him. His official portrait we have on display, other imagery of the family, Frank throughout his life, how he develops as a politician, political cartoons, both for and against, to tell his story through the images we have there. And this is getting into next year too, when that exhibit goes, we're going to do an exhibit on quilting in Tennessee, so come by for that. Hopefully we won't have too much static in the building with all those quilts, but you never quite know. Ceiling's made of tin, so hopefully that'll discharge some of it there. We have coming up this fall, we've got Clink at the Clement, which actually will be around Christmas. It's a big event we hold every year. But the biggest event, the thing I am working the hardest on right now, is our 2023, our 7th annual Legacy event. Legacy is a fundraiser. It is our biggest fundraiser at the museum. We are a nonprofit 501c3. So when you come to the museum, when you pay admission, when you give a donation, anything you do with the museum monetarily goes right back into the site so we can pay the staff, keep the lights on, and put on programming for the public. Our legacy event is our largest fundraiser. It will be held at the museum November the 2nd. But it's not just a fundraiser. It is an award ceremony where we will honor and recognize individuals that have made a significant and positive impact in our community, our state, or our nation. Past honorees have been Jeannie Seeley, the Grand Ole Opry star, which, by the way, has the most appearances of any person on the Grand Ole Opry, 5,295 appearances. I saw her last week, so I know the exact number. We've honored Senator Lamar Alexander's former state senator Annabelle Clement O'Brien, if you remember that great lady. This year we're going to be honoring 4 individuals, the Jackson family. Doctors L.C., William, and Jimmy Jackson, all no longer around. Their descendants will accept the awards on their behalf. They were the founders of what is now TriStar Horizon Medical Center in Dixon, so they're huge with the medical field in Tennessee. And Gene Ward. Gene Ward is not just married to Jeannie Seeley, but he was general counsel for the Nashville Electric Service, for the Public Service Commission. He was a humorist. He was Frank Clement's speechwriter and his driver, so worked very closely with him. He'll turn 91 this year, so we're honoring him as well. And I'm sure we're also going to have a musical performance as well, and I don't quite know exactly who's doing that yet, so I'll hold to keep you in anticipation on who our star might be. Last year we had country star Mark Colley do an amazing program for us there. So we hope you can come out and see these things. You can follow us on our Facebook page at Clement Railroad Hotel Museum. Follow us on Instagram, CRHM_Dixon. You can also give me your information. I'll put you on our newsletter. You can join the museum. We do accept memberships as well. You can visit our website, ClementRailroadMuseum.org. Leave out the hotel. ClementRailroadMuseum.org. You can keep up to date on all of our upcoming events, all of our shows, all of our lectures, all of our presentations, all of our programs, and all of our events that need to give money to us that way. Of course, as a nonprofit, I always got to put that in. But again, I appreciate you having me out here tonight. Hope to see you in Dixon. Hope to see you at this exhibit. It's been a great night. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation from our lady of Erin, Ms. Lucille Clement. Our next meeting is our big one in August 19th at 2 o'clock at the Forum at Houston County High School. As Jackie mentioned, there's some photos on the right. We'd love for you to take time and look at those. That's just a sampling of what we have, and we hope to see you then. September and October are open for meeting agenda. If you have a program you would like to present for September and October, let me know. Otherwise, we'll see what we can come up with. And if there's a motion to adjourn, all right.
Second.
We'll adjourn. Thank you all for coming.